The expression, "don't meet your heroes," gets at the idea that sometimes it's better to leave your idols at a distance, as they oftentimes don't live up to their expectations. And I'm not gonna lie, that was kind of the idea going through my head as I eagerly awaited this, the latest generation Transition TransAM. The Trans Am was actually one of my first dream bikes as I entered the sport 10 or so years ago, but I never got the chance to ride one. That is, until now. And I'm happy to report that at least the 20-year-old me would be very stoked on how this new bike turned out. But I'll be honest that the older, more prudent, and let's be real, more boring version of myself was a little bit less satisfied. So let's get into things and see where you line up on the Josh aging spectrum and figure out whether the Trans Am should be your next bike. The 2024 Trans Am is an unapologetically simple bike, and I love that about it. I think it looks great, especially with this chrome paint job that does set you back an extra $100. Speaking of prices, the complete bike lists for $2,699, and you can buy the frame alone for $799. And we'll talk more about the value you're getting for that in a little bit. Like its predecessors, the Trans Am is made out of 4130 chromoly steel. And unlike some other steel frames I've ridden recently, it really does live up to the whole steel is real reputation. It was impressively supple, damping vibrations and taking the edge off of bigger impacts and landings. Cable routing is a fully external affair, other than the dropper cable that enters through the bottom of the seat tube. Inside the front triangle are 4 mounting bolts, meaning you have plenty of room to mount a water bottle and a toolkit. At the back of the bike are a pair of UDH-compatible sliding dropouts, which should make the single speeders happy, as well as the integrated ISCG tabs for those looking to relive the hardtail freeride days. The bike also comes with what appears to be a pretty wimpy chainstay guard, but I was actually impressed by just how quiet this bike was, even again on those rougher, jankier trails. Lastly, it's definitely worth noting that the Trans Am frame gets the same lifetime warranty as every other Transition model, as well as their crash replacement assistance, and those two things combined are one of the better programs out there. Next, let's talk geometry. With the 64-degree head tube angle and 150mm fork, it definitely falls into the hardcore hardtail side of the spectrum. The size large that I tested has a reach of 485mm, a tall 646mm stack height, and 76.5-degree seat tube angle. The sliding dropouts on the back of the bike allow the chainstays to be adjusted from 425 to 437mm, and when slammed, they had just barely enough room for the stock 2.4-inch Maxxis DHR2. Now, the Trans Am is only sold as a full 29-inch setup, but Transition does say that it is mullet compatible and can even be ridden in a full 27.5-inch setup, and that will lower the bottom bracket by 13mm. Now, to me, that sounds like a recipe for a lot of pedal strikes on the way up, but a ton of fun on the way back down. Speaking of adjustability, the bike has also been rated to run plus or minus 10mm from the stock 150mm Marzocchi Bomber Z2 fork. I've ridden this fork on quite a few bikes in the past, and I've been equally impressed each time. The rail damper has a wide range of usable compression adjustment, and the thicker stanchion walls used by Marzocchi makes it noticeably stiffer than its sibling, the Fox 34. The group set on this thing is taken care of by SRAM, with an NX drivetrain and DB8 brakes. Now, I have these same DB8s on my personal bike, and I think they're one of the best budget brakes on the market, and are very well suited to the Trans Am. I also didn't have any issues with the NX drivetrain during the 50+ miles I put on the bike, though in my experience, these can have a tendency to repeatedly fall out of proper adjustment once they've been worn in. Another part spec that I was super stoked on is this big ol' 210mm one-up dropper seat post that comes spec'd on the large and extra large. It's super annoying for me when bikes come with a 150 or 170mm post, and so kudos to Transition for just including that right out of the box. You also get a nice branded cockpit with a 40mm race face Affect R stem, 35mm rise Affect R bars, and ODI Elite Flow grips. In terms of wheels and tires, the Trans Am rolls on a pair of WTB STI 30 wheels laced to Novatec hubs. In addition to small dropper posts, another pet peeve I have is very low engagement hubs, and thankfully, these were pretty impressive, again, especially for the bike at this price point. Lastly, wrapped around those wheels are a pair of Maxxis tires with a 2.5-inch Assegai 3C EXO Plus in the front and a 2.4-inch Minion DHR2 3C EXO Plus in the rear. Now, I have a bit of a reputation amongst the 99 Spokes crew of being an Assegai hater, and to be honest, a big place where that comes from is when they're spec'd on bikes like this. Now, I get it, this is an aggressive hardtail, but I really think this bike would have been a bit more fun with some faster rolling tires. That said, I am thankful for the EXO Plus casings. All in all, that put the weight of my size large demo bike at just under 34 pounds or 15.4 kilograms. This bike gets kind of interesting when it comes to value. Obviously, it'd be easy to get a similarly spec'd hardtail for less money, but I really think there's something to be said about how Transition definitely paid attention to the details here, with things like, again, that long travel dropper post and the EXO Plus casing tires means there's less a picky rider like myself will have to replace early on. There's also that warranty and crash replacement plan that I talked about earlier. And to be honest, I think I'd rather have a bike from a company that I know has my back if things go wrong than get a bike with a GX derailleur and then have them leave me high and dry if I ever run into an issue. Lastly, you can't forget about the steel frame, which really does give you a unique and different riding sensation than an alloy one. So all in all, I think there's more value here in this Transition TransAM than really comes out if you just look at the part spec. Moving on then to how the Transition feels on the trail, and we'll start with the climbs. The climbing position was immediately comfortable, with the high stack and relatively steep seat tube angle putting you in an easygoing, upright position. As far as hardtails go, this bike was by no means the most energetic or eager on the way up, and I think a big part of that comes down to the tires. Like I mentioned earlier, if it were my bike, I'd probably put on a pair of dissectors or maybe even a Recon on the back. Where it really did shine though was on technical climbs, where the 150mm fork, supple steel frame, and short chainstays provided great grip and of course immediate power delivery. It suffered a bit more on tight switchbacks, where it took a bit more intentionality to finesse the long wheelbase around. And it was a similar story on the way back down. Initially, I was a little disappointed in the bike. It didn't feel like it had that same playful, carefree attitude that most hardtails do. But turns out, I just hadn't taken it into its natural habitat yet, and that is fast tech. I was genuinely impressed by just how well the bike held its line through steep braking bumps and rock gardens. I think a lot of this comes down to that steel tubing, but I'm sure a lot of it also comes to those big old tires that I kind of dogged on a little bit earlier. Regardless of the reason though, I think it's safe to say that this is one of the best handling hardtails in that fast, rocky tech that I've ridden in a long time. Sadly, we are in full dust season here in Central Oregon, which means I didn't get to spend as much time with this bike on some jumpy flow trails as I would have liked, but based on my limited experience doing that, I think it's safe to say that it's not going to be the most poppy or flickable hardtail out there, but it can certainly hold its own, and I'm sure it would excel even more on higher speed, bike park style jump lines. Reflecting on it now, it's really not much of a surprise that the Trans Am had the ride characteristics that it does. Transition is based in Bellingham, Washington. And for those of you who've never been, just picture a mountain bike fantasy land where the average 5th grader is better than your local pro, and the blue trails make you pucker more than a Warhead's flavored mouthguard. And this seems to be the type of riding that the Trans Am was designed for. And that's great if you're like the 20-year-old version of myself, fit, fearless, and with something to prove. But if you're more like the 30-year-old version of myself, then there's a good chance you probably prefer using a full suspension trail bike for the type of demanding trails the Trans Am excels on, and may be better off with a slightly sportier hardtail for less challenging terrain. Now, don't get me wrong, I love hardtails and love even more people who push hardtails like the Trans Am to their limit. But I think for most people, the Trans Am might be just a bit too much bike for the places they plan to use it. The aggressive hardtail market has grown tremendously, which means it has a lot of competition. The first bike that I want to compare it to is from a fellow Bellingham brand, Kona, and that is of course the Hanzo ESD. Despite coming out several years earlier, this is an equally aggressive steel hardtail. It lists for $2,299, $400 less than the Trans Am. For that, you'll get a pretty comparable part spec, the biggest difference being the SLX and XT drivetrain that comes with the Hanzo, which is a big step up from the NX on the Transition. So Kona definitely takes the cake in terms of value in that regard, but Transition, like I said earlier, really has put a lot of attention to detail into this bike, with those UDH compatible sliding dropouts, nice tires, long travel dropper post. I think it means there's going to be less parts you're going to need to replace down the road, again, maybe with the exception of that drivetrain. Now, the next bike that I want to compare the Trans Am to takes a slightly different approach to the aggressive hardtail, and that's the Marin San Quentin 3 29er. This aluminum bike lists for $1,799, nearly $1,000 less than the Trans Am. Despite that, it still gets a pretty formidable set of components, including the same Marzocchi Bomber Z2 fork, as well as a Shimano Dior drivetrain and TRP Slate Evo brakes. We actually did a review on this bike earlier last fall, and my quick take on kind of the differences between these two is that the Marin is a bit more responsive, and of course that's going to make it more fun on those flowier jump line trails, but definitely not quite as composed in the faster tech where the Transition really shined. It's in these places that you can really feel the difference between that steel frame and the harsher aluminum one. So which bike is better? Well, I'm going to say that the Marin San Quentin 3 is a great bike for newcomers or groms looking to get an aggressive bike without breaking the bank. But if I were choosing the bike that I, a more experienced cyclist, would want to buy and keep for years, maybe a decade to come, then it's hard to pass up on the Trans Am's combination of classic simplicity with modern geometry and standards. So, do I regret meeting my hero, the Transition TransAM? Absolutely not. Though I do wish we would have met a little bit earlier when I was maybe a bit less risk adverse, because let me tell you, this bike rips. It's one of the best handling hardtails I've ever ridden in steep technical terrain. And if you're on the market for a hardtail that can whoop up on your full squish friends, then it certainly is the bike for you. But if you're looking for a bike that you plan to use on cross-country rides or flowy blue single track, then you might want to look elsewhere. If you have any more questions about the Transition TransAM, then you can go ahead and leave those down in the comments, and as always, I'll be sure to get you an answer. Lastly, before you get out of here, please go ahead, hit that like button, subscribe to the 99 Spokes YouTube channel, and of course, remember that bikes are for everyone. Have fun out there.